There are some sins we commit against children that we never see, until heaven itself decides to show us. This is the story of Daniel Reyes, a 7-year-old boy in Fresno, California, who became so invisible to the world that only the Mother of God could find him. And when she did, she didn't just console him. She shattered every heart that had turned away from his suffering. If you're watching this today, it's because you need to hear what happened in that abandoned playground. Subscribe now to receive daily miracles of Our Lady in your life, because what I'm about to share will change the way you see every lonely child, every silent cry, every moment you thought no one was listening. Daniel lived with his parents, Rosa and Javier Reyes, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Fresno, where the summer heat baked the asphalt until it shimmered like water, and the nights brought no relief. Only the distant sound of sirens and arguments through thin walls. His parents were Mexican immigrants who had crossed the border with nothing but hope and calloused hands, and they poured every ounce of strength into the unforgiving labor of California's agricultural fields. They left for work at 4 a.m, when the stars were still visible and Daniel was still asleep, and they returned after dark, their backs bent and their spirits depleted, smelling of pesticides and exhaustion. Daniel was their only child. Their miracle, Rosa used to call him, before the exhaustion stole the poetry from her voice. She had suffered 3 miscarriages before Daniel, and the doctors said she would never carry to term. But she prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe every night, and Daniel arrived, small, premature, but alive. They named him Daniel because it meant, God is my judge, and they believed God had judged them worthy of this gift. But gifts require care, and care requires time, and time was the one luxury Rosa and Javier could not afford. By the time Daniel turned 7, he had learned to wake himself up, dress himself, pour his own cereal, and walk the 6 blocks to Jefferson Elementary School alone. He had learned to return to an empty apartment, heat up leftover beans or tortillas, and spend the long hours until his parents came home sitting on the frayed couch, staring at the television without really watching it, or drawing pictures that no one ever asked to see. He had learned that being alone was simply the way things were, like the heat in summer or the way his shoes never quite fit right because they were bought too big so he could grow into them. What Daniel had not learned, what no 7-year-old should have to learn, was how to endure cruelty. At Jefferson Elementary, Daniel was different, and different was dangerous. He was small for his age, with dark eyes that seemed too large for his face, and a quietness that the other children interpreted as weakness. He struggled with reading, the letters swimming on the page in ways that frustrated his teachers and humiliated him during class. He spoke with a slight accent, a melodic lilt inherited from parents who spoke Spanish at home, and this became ammunition for mockery. He brought burritos wrapped in foil for lunch while other kids had Lunchables and Capri Suns, and he wore the same 3 shirts in rotation because Rosa did laundry only once a week when she had the energy. The bullying started small, whispered insults, deliberate exclusion from games at recess, stolen pencils, but cruelty, like a disease, always progresses when left untreated. By spring of 2nd grade, Daniel had become the designated target for a group of 5 boys led by Tyler Brennan, a stocky kid with freckles and a mean streak he'd learned from an older brother, who'd learned it from a father who drank. Tyler had that particular genius for finding the exact words that cut deepest. He called Daniel Taco Boy and made exaggerated accents when talking near him. He tripped Daniel in the hallway. He convinced other kids that touching Daniel would give you Mexican germs. Mrs. Mitchell, Daniel's teacher, was a veteran educator in her late 50s who had long ago developed the selective blindness that allows teachers to survive in underfunded schools with overcrowded classrooms. She saw the bruises on Daniel's shins, but attributed them to roughhousing. She heard the whispers but told herself boys would be boys. She noticed Daniel's increasing withdrawal, how he stopped raising his hand, how he ate lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, how his drawings became darker and more chaotic, but she had 28 other students and a curriculum to teach and standardized tests to prepare for. And Daniel was quiet, so Daniel was easy to overlook. Rosa and Javier noticed nothing because they were barely present. They asked Daniel how school was going, and he said fine, because he had learned that any other answer led to conversations they were too tired to have. They loved him. They loved him desperately. But love without presence is like sunlight without warmth. You can see it, but you can't feel it. On a Tuesday in late April, something happened that Daniel would never speak about, not even years later when therapists would gently probe. During the afternoon recess, Tyler and his friends cornered Daniel in the boys' bathroom. What began as routine mockery escalated into something darker. They pushed Daniel into a stall. They held the door closed. And then, whether out of malice or the terrifying thoughtlessness of children who don't yet understand consequences, they urinated on him through the gap at the bottom of the door while Daniel sobbed and begged them to stop. When they finally let him out, Daniel stood shaking in a puddle of his own humiliation, his pants soaked, his spirit shattered. Tyler laughed and said, "Don't tell anyone, Taco Boy, or we'll do worse." Daniel didn't tell anyone. He snuck to the nurse's office, claimed he'd had an accident, and was given spare clothes from the lost and found, pants 3 sizes too big that he had to hold up with one hand. He endured the stares and whispers for the rest of the day with his eyes on the floor, his soul somewhere far away where pain couldn't reach it. When the final bell rang, Daniel didn't go home. He couldn't face the empty apartment, the silence that would amplify his shame. Instead, he walked in the opposite direction, past the corner store with the faded Corona sign, past the check-cashing place and the laundromat, toward the old St. Anthony's Chapel, a small Catholic church that served Fresno's Mexican community. Built decades ago when the neighborhood had been more prosperous and now slowly crumbling from deferred maintenance and declining attendance. Behind the chapel was an abandoned playground, a relic from when the church had run a daycare. The equipment was rusted and covered in graffiti, the swings hanging from chains that squeaked in the wind, the slides' paint peeling away in strips. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but there was a gap where the fence had been bent back and neighborhood kids sometimes snuck in to smoke or drink. Daniel squeezed through the gap and walked to the swing set. He sat on one of the swings, his feet barely touching the ground, and began to cry. Not the quiet tears he shed in the apartment, not the suppressed sobs he choked back at school, but the deep heaving cries of a child whose spirit has been pushed past its breaking point, when the body expels grief in waves that feel like they might never stop. "Nobody loves me," he whispered between sobs. "Nobody wants me. I wish I was dead. I wish I was never born." These are words that should never come from a 7-year-old's mouth. These are prayers that should shatter heaven's gates with their injustice. The sun was beginning to set, painting the Fresno sky in shades of orange and purple. The playground was empty, except for Daniel and the lengthening shadows. He cried until his throat hurt, until his eyes burned, until he felt completely emptied out. A hollow shell of a boy on a rusty swing in an abandoned playground behind a forgotten church. And then he felt warmth. Not from the sun, which was descending. Not from the air, which was cooling. But a warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like being wrapped in invisible arms. Daniel looked up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. A woman was walking toward him across the playground. She was dressed in a long blue dress covered with a white mantle that seemed to catch the fading light and reflect it back softer, gentler. Her face was young but somehow ageless, with dark hair partially visible beneath her covering, and eyes that held a sorrow and kindness so deep that Daniel felt it in his chest before she even spoke. She moved with a grace that seemed wrong for the cracked asphalt and scattered beer cans, as if she were walking on different ground than what Daniel could see. Daniel wasn't afraid. He should have been, a strange woman approaching a child alone in an empty playground, but fear was impossible in her presence. Instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. Safe. She sat on the swing next to him, and the rusty chains made no sound under her weight. "Hola, mi niño," she said softly in perfect Spanish, her voice like music. "Why are you crying?" Daniel's tears started fresh. "Because nobody loves me. Because I'm alone. Because the kids at school are mean to me and my parents are never home and I don't have any friends and I wish I was dead." The woman's expression shifted. and for a moment Daniel saw such profound sadness in her eyes that he wondered if she might cry too. But then she smiled, a smile that somehow contained all the world's sorrow and all its hope at the same time. "Oh, Daniel," she said, and hearing his name from her lips felt like coming home. "You are never alone. Never. Even when your parents are working and you feel invisible at school. Even in that bathroom when you thought no one saw your suffering. I saw you. I have always seen you. I have been with you every single moment." "Who are you?" Daniel whispered. "I am a mother who loves all children, especially those who hurt the most. I am here because your tears reached heaven, mijito. And when a child cries like you have cried, I come. Always." She reached out and gently wiped a tear from Daniel's cheek. Her touch was soft and cool, like the feeling of shade on a hot day. "But the kids hate me. Tyler and his friends. They did something bad to me today, really bad. And Mrs. Mitchell doesn't care, nobody cares." "I care," the woman said firmly, "and I promise you, Daniel, those boys will understand what they've done. Not because I will punish them, but because their hearts will be changed. Sometimes the hardest hearts need to be broken open so love can get in." They sat together as the sky darkened, and the woman talked to Daniel about how precious he was, how his struggles with reading didn't define his worth, how being different was not the same as being less, how his parents' absence was born of their love. They worked themselves to exhaustion to give him a better life than they'd had. She talked about suffering and why God allows it, about how some of the greatest saints had been lonely children who learned to find friendship with heaven when earth offered them none. Daniel listened, not understanding everything but feeling understood for the first time in his life. "I have something for you," the woman said finally. She reached into a fold of her mantle and pulled out a rosary. The beads were simple wood, worn smooth from use, and the crucifix was small and silver. "This belonged to someone who loved you very much even though you never met her. Keep it with you, Daniel. When you feel alone, hold it and remember, you are seen, you are loved, you are never forgotten." She placed the rosary in Daniel's hands. The beads were warm, as if they'd been sitting in sunlight. "Will I see you again?" Daniel asked, suddenly afraid she would disappear. "You will see me again," she promised. "But even when you don't see me, I will be near. Always." She stood gracefully, and her dress seemed to shimmer in the twilight. "Go home now, mijito. Your mother is looking for you. She's very worried." Daniel blinked, and in that instant, the fraction of a second between closing his eyes and opening them, the woman was gone. Not walking away, not leaving. Just gone. As if she had never been there except that the warmth remained and the rosary was solid and real in his hands. He looked around the empty playground, at the rusted swings now moving slightly in a breeze he couldn't feel, and somehow he knew with absolute certainty that everything would be different now. Daniel squeezed back through the gap in the fence and started running toward home, clutching the rosary tightly. As he approached his apartment building, he saw his mother on the sidewalk, pacing frantically with her cell phone pressed to her ear, still wearing her work clothes stained with dirt from the fields. When she saw Daniel, she let out a cry and ran to him, pulling him into an embrace so tight he could barely breathe. "Daniel! Daniel! Where were you? I've been calling the school, calling your father. I was about to call the police. Mijo, you can't disappear like that. You can't." She was crying and scolding him and holding him all at once, relief and terror mixing in her voice. "Mama, I'm sorry, I went to the playground by St. Anthony's and..." "That place? Daniel, it's not safe. You..." She stopped suddenly, pulling back to look at him. "What's that in your hand?" Daniel opened his palm to show her the rosary. Rosa's face went pale. She staggered slightly, and for a moment Daniel thought she might faint. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "The lady gave it to me, the nice lady in the blue dress who..." "Daniel, where did you get this?" Rosa's voice was sharp now, frightened. She took the rosary from his hand, holding it up to the streetlight. Her fingers were trembling. "I told you the lady..." Daniel, this is impossible. This is... Rosa's voice broke. This is my mother's rosary. My mother's. I buried it with her 5 years ago in Guadalajara. I watched them put it in her hands before they closed the casket. This exact rosary, with the chip on the third bead and the crucifix with the bent arm. I would know it anywhere. Daniel, this is impossible. They stood on the sidewalk as darkness fell over Fresno, Rosa holding the rosary like it might burn her. Daniel trying to explain about the woman in the playground, about the things she said, about how she knew his name and wiped away his tears. She said she's always watching me, Daniel said. She said I'm never alone. Mama, she was so beautiful and she loved me, I could feel it. Rosa looked at her son, then at the rosary, then back at her son. Tears were streaming down her face now, but they were different than the tears of panic from minutes before. These were tears of recognition, of awe, of something beyond fear or relief. Mijo, she whispered, do you know who you met today? That night, Rosa didn't go to bed. She knelt at the small shrine in her bedroom, a corner with a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe, dried flowers, and a candle, and prayed until dawn. Javier found her there when he woke for work, her face wet with tears, the rosary clutched in her hands. Something happened to Daniel yesterday, she told him. Something impossible. The next morning, Daniel didn't want to go to school. He begged his mother to let him stay home, his stomach churning with dread at the thought of facing Tyler and the others, of seeing the bathroom where his humiliation had occurred. But Rosa, still shaken by the previous night's revelation, insisted. You must go, mijo. Trust what the lady told you. Trust that you are protected. Daniel walked to Jefferson Elementary with the rosary hidden in his pocket, his hand wrapped around the beads for courage. When he entered his classroom, Tyler Brennan was already there, standing by Mrs. Mitchell's desk. As Daniel approached his seat, Tyler suddenly turned and walked directly toward him. Daniel braced himself, his hand tightening around the rosary, but Tyler didn't shove him. He didn't insult him. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, his face contorted with an emotion Daniel had never seen there before. Shame. Daniel, Tyler said quietly, so quietly the other kids couldn't hear. I'm sorry. For yesterday, and for everything. It was wrong. Really wrong. I don't know why I did it, but last night I had this dream and... He stopped, struggling for words. I'm really sorry. I won't bother you anymore. Before Daniel could respond, Tyler walked quickly back to his seat, his face red. One by one throughout the morning, the other boys who had been involved in the bathroom incident approached Daniel and apologized. None of them could fully explain why. They said things like, I just felt like I had to, or I couldn't stop thinking about it, or my mom didn't even make me, I just knew I needed to say sorry. Mrs. Mitchell noticed the shift immediately. She had taught long enough to know that spontaneous apologies from groups of second-grade boys were essentially unheard of, especially without adult intervention. She watched Daniel throughout the day, noticing something different about him. A quiet confidence, a peace that seemed to radiate from him despite everything he'd endured. During afternoon recess, while Daniel sat on a bench reading, Mrs. Mitchell stood at the classroom window watching the playground. The light was strange that day. The California sun filtered through high clouds that made everything look softer, more ethereal. And then she saw her, a woman in blue and white standing at the edge of the playground, not inside the fence but just beyond it, watching Daniel with an expression of such tenderness that Mrs. Mitchell felt her throat tighten. The woman was too far away to see clearly, but Mrs. Mitchell got an impression of extraordinary beauty, of a presence that seemed wrong for a school playground, too luminous, too otherworldly. Mrs. Mitchell blinked and rubbed her eyes, wondering if the sun had affected her vision. She looked back at the playground. The woman was gone, but that wasn't what made Mrs. Mitchell's hand start to shake. What made her stumble back from the window, her heart pounding, was the sudden, terrible realization. Her classroom was on the third floor. The window was 30 feet above the ground. There was no balcony, no platform, nothing for anyone to stand on outside that window. Whoever, whatever, she had seen had been standing in midair. Mrs. Catherine Mitchell had not prayed in 17 years. She had been raised Methodist in a small town in Oregon, attended church every Sunday until she was 18, and then, like so many young people who taste freedom for the first time, she had drifted away. College brought new ideas, new friends, new priorities. Her faith became something embarrassing, a remnant of childhood she'd outgrown like training wheels or bedtime stories. By the time she moved to Fresno and began teaching, God had become a hypothesis she'd tested and rejected, filed away with Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny in the category of beautiful lies adults tell children. But now, standing at that third-floor window with her hands trembling and her rational mind scrambling for explanations that wouldn't come, Catherine Mitchell found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken since she was a child. God, what did I just see? The woman in blue haunted her for the rest of that day and into the night. She told no one. Who would believe her? She'd barely believed her own eyes. But she couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't dismiss it as a trick of light or a hallucination brought on by stress and too much coffee. The image was too clear, too vivid. A woman suspended in air 30 feet above the ground, watching Daniel Reyes with a mother's love. And Daniel himself had changed. Catherine had taught hundreds of children over her career, and she'd developed an instinct for reading them, for sensing the invisible burdens they carried. Daniel had been drowning for months. She could admit that now, could acknowledge her own blindness. But since yesterday, something fundamental had shifted. The boy who had shuffled into class that morning carrying shame like a visible weight had transformed. He sat straighter. He made eye contact. When Tyler Brennan apologized to him, an event so unexpected Catherine had nearly dropped her coffee mug, Daniel had accepted with a grace that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old who'd been brutally bullied just 24 hours earlier. That evening, Catherine did something she hadn't done in nearly 2 decades. She went to church. Not to St. Anthony's. She didn't know it existed. Instead, she drove to Fresno Community Methodist, the large suburban church where she'd attended a colleague's wedding 5 years ago. The building was modern, all glass and blonde wood with contemporary worship music, and a pastor who wore jeans and quoted TED Talks. She sat in the back pew during Wednesday evening service, barely listening to the sermon, her mind replaying that impossible moment at the window over and over. Afterward, she approached the pastor, a friendly man in his 40s named Derek, who had the perpetual enthusiasm of someone who'd found Jesus at a youth retreat and never quite come down. I think I might have seen something, Catherine began, then stopped, hearing how insane it sounded. Something I can't explain. Pastor Derek smiled encouragingly. That's wonderful. God works in mysterious ways. Would you like to pray about it? I think I saw the Virgin Mary, Catherine blurted out. The smile faltered slightly. Oh, well, that's interesting. You know, we don't really, Methodists don't typically. Catherine left before he could finish, feeling foolish. She drove home in silence, her faith, or whatever this new confused feeling was, finding no home in the sterile comfort of contemporary Protestantism. But she couldn't let it go. The next day at school, Catherine paid attention to Daniel with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She watched him at his desk, at recess, in the cafeteria. She noted that the bullying had completely stopped, not reduced, not diminished, but ceased entirely, as if someone had flipped a switch. Tyler Brennan now avoided Daniel entirely, and the other boys who'd tormented him acted as if the previous months had never happened. During lunch, while the children ate in the cafeteria, Catherine pulled up a chair next to Daniel, who was carefully eating a burrito his mother had packed. "Daniel," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" He looked at her with those large, dark eyes, and Catherine was struck by how clear they were, how free of the haunted quality that had shadowed them for months. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell. Yesterday after school. Where did you go?" Daniel hesitated, his hand moving to his pocket where Catherine could see the outline of something small. "I went to the playground, by the church." "St. Anthony's?" He nodded. "Did something happen there?" Daniel's face brightened with a joy so pure it made Catherine's chest ache. "I met a lady. She was really nice. She talked to me and gave me something special." His hand emerged from his pocket, clutching a wooden rosary. "She said I'm never alone." Catherine stared at the rosary, her mind making connections she didn't want to make but couldn't avoid. What did she look like? She was beautiful. She wore a blue dress and a white thing on her head. He gestured vaguely at his hair. "And she was so nice, Mrs. Mitchell. She knew my name and she told me everything would be okay. And it is okay. Tyler said sorry and nobody's mean anymore and I don't feel sad." "Daniel, did she tell you her name?" "No, but my mom knows who she is." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a secret. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think I met the Virgin Mary, like the real one, the mother of Jesus." Catherine's hands had started trembling again. "Why do you think that?" "Because the rosary she gave me is impossible." Daniel's 7-year-old voice struggled with the concept. "It belonged to my grandma in Mexico. My mom buried it with her 5 years ago. She watched them put it in the coffin. But the lady had it. She gave it to me. My mom cried all night because she said it's impossible, but here it is." He held up the rosary, and Catherine saw it clearly now. Worn wooden beads, a silver crucifix with a slightly bent arm, and on the third bead from the crucifix, a small chip in the wood. "My mom took a picture of it," Daniel continued, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Look." He unfolded what appeared to be a printed photograph, slightly grainy, clearly taken with a phone camera and printed at home. It showed a rosary lying on what looked like white satin, cradled in the pale, lifeless hands of an elderly woman in a coffin. The rosary was identical to the one Daniel held. Same wooden beads, same silver crucifix, same chip on the third bead. "This was at my grandma's funeral," Daniel explained. "My mom kept this picture. She says it's the same rosary. Exactly the same. She says it's a milagro." Catherine's rational mind threw up every possible explanation: a replica, a mistaken memory, a coincidence, but none of them held water. The photograph was clear. The rosary in Daniel's hand matched it perfectly, and Daniel's mother, whom Catherine had met at parent-teacher conferences, had struck her as a sensible, hard-working woman, not prone to religious hysteria. "Daniel, I need to talk to your mother," Catherine said. "Would that be okay?" That afternoon, Rosa Reyes arrived at the school for an impromptu conference, bringing with her Javier and Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest from St. Anthony's Chapel. Catherine had called Rosa that morning, and Rosa, who had spent the previous 2 nights praying and weeping and trying to understand what was happening to her family, had immediately contacted her priest. Father Miguel was 83 years old, a Mexican immigrant who had served the Fresno community for 56 years. He had seen much in his long ministry: poverty, violence, addiction, miracles both large and small. But when Rosa had arrived at his door yesterday with the rosary and the story of Daniel's encounter, he had wept like a child. "My daughter," he had told Rosa, "the Virgin does not appear to the powerful or the important. She appears to the suffering, to the forgotten, to those whom the world overlooks. If she came to your son, it is because his pain reached heaven itself." Now, in Mrs. Mitchell's classroom after school hours, 5 adults sat in chairs designed for 7-year-olds, their knees nearly to their chests, discussing the impossible. Catherine told them everything: the woman at the window, the sudden change in the bullying, her own inexplicable certainty that she'd witnessed something beyond natural explanation. She expected skepticism, but instead found belief. "Others have seen her too," Father Miguel said quietly. "I did not want to say anything until I had more evidence, but in the past 3 days, 4 different people from our parish have reported seeing a woman in blue near the playground. One saw her at dawn, kneeling in prayer in the abandoned equipment. Another saw her in the evening, standing by the old shrine we have near the chapel entrance. A third saw her walking through the neighborhood where the poorest families live." "Who are these people?" Catherine asked. "Are they reliable?" "One is a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital. One is a construction worker. One is a grandmother who has attended daily mass for 40 years, and one, Father Miguel's voice softened, is a former gang member who has been trying to leave that life but struggling with addiction. He says he saw the woman 3 nights ago when he was about to use drugs. She spoke to him, he says, and he has been sober since. Rosa and Javier sat hand in hand, their worn faces reflecting a mixture of awe and fear. "What does this mean?" Rosa asked. "Why would she come here? Why would she appear to our son?" "Because your son's suffering was great," Father Miguel said simply, "and because Fresno is not so different from Nazareth. A poor place, an overlooked place, a place where people struggle and suffer and cry out to God. These are the places heaven pays attention to." Catherine felt something cracking open inside her chest, 17 years of careful atheism fracturing under the weight of evidence she couldn't deny. "What do we do now?" "We watch," Father Miguel said. "We pray. We document everything carefully. The church has protocols for these matters. They are slow and skeptical, as they should be. Most reported apparitions are not genuine, but some are. And if this is real, if the Mother of God has truly come to Fresno, to this forgotten playground, to this suffering child, then she has come for a reason. We must discover what that reason is." Over the next week, the signs multiplied. A teenage girl named Maria Gutierrez, who had been planning her suicide for months after being trafficked by her own uncle, saw a woman in blue standing at the end of her street on the night she'd decided to take the pills she'd been hoarding. The woman simply looked at her and smiled, and Maria, who couldn't explain it, who told the crisis counselor she met with afterward that it made no rational sense, suddenly felt a love so overwhelming that she fell to her knees and sobbed. She flushed the pills and called the police about her uncle, who was arrested 3 days later. An undocumented family facing deportation after 20 years in Fresno saw the woman in their backyard the night before their hearing. Their 3 children watched as she walked through their mother's vegetable garden, touching the plants gently, her presence filling the air with the scent of roses even though no roses grew there. The next day, a clerical error was discovered in their deportation order. Someone had filed paperwork for the wrong family. They were granted a stay while their case was reviewed. A man named Robert Chen, a Taiwanese-American atheist who taught chemistry at Fresno State, was driving home from work when he saw a woman in blue standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on his brakes, his heart pounding, certain he was about to hit her. She looked directly at him through the windshield, and he later told his wife, who was Catholic and whom he'd spent 15 years gently mocking for her faith, that he'd seen infinite compassion in her eyes. When he blinked, she was gone. He drove home shaking, pulled his wife into his arms and said, "I need you to teach me how to pray. Something just happened that I can't explain, and I think I've been wrong about everything." The story spread through the Mexican community like wildfire, then jumped barriers of language and culture, reaching Filipino families, Vietnamese families, African American families, white families who'd lived in Fresno for generations. St. Anthony's Chapel, which had been struggling with declining attendance and might have closed within a year, suddenly found itself packed for daily mass. Father Miguel had to add additional confession times because people were lining up for hours to confess sins they'd been carrying for decades, all saying the same thing. "I saw her," or "I heard about her," or "Something is happening and I need to be right with God." News crews arrived, skeptical reporters looking for the story behind the religious fervor. But when they interviewed witnesses, they found no consistent narrative beyond the woman in blue, no organized effort to create a hoax, no leader figure manipulating the crowds. Just dozens of individual people from diverse backgrounds, many of whom didn't know each other, all reporting experiences they struggled to describe but couldn't deny. Daniel Reyes, meanwhile, returned to school each day and lived the quiet life of a 7-year-old boy who was no longer afraid. The transformation in him was so complete that it became its own kind of evidence. Teachers who had written him off as a troubled child needing special education intervention now watched him excel. He still struggled with reading, but he approached it with determination rather than shame. His drawings, which had been dark and violent, now showed bright colors, families holding hands, images of a beautiful woman surrounded by light. Tyler Brennan's transformation was almost as dramatic. The boy who had led the bullying campaign against Daniel became, inexplicably, his protector. When a new student tried to mock Daniel's accent, Tyler stepped in immediately. "Don't talk to him like that. Daniel's my friend." The two boys didn't become close, the wounds were too fresh, but an understanding existed between them, a shared knowledge of something that had changed Tyler at a level he couldn't articulate but couldn't deny. Mrs. Mitchell began attending daily mass at St. Anthony's, sitting in the back and watching, still uncertain but unable to stay away. The small chapel felt different now, holier somehow, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her eyes fill with tears she didn't understand. She started reading about Marian apparitions, about Lourdes and Fatima and Guadalupe, about how the Virgin Mary had appeared throughout history to children and peasants and the powerless. She read with the desperate hunger of someone whose entire worldview was being reconstructed from the ground up. Father Miguel began keeping detailed records of every reported sighting, every healing, every conversion. He contacted the Diocese of Fresno, reporting the events carefully and without exaggeration. The bishop, a pragmatic man who had dealt with his share of religious enthusiasm, listened politely and promised to send an investigator. He had heard such reports before. Most were products of overwrought imaginations or mass hysteria. But something in Father Miguel's voice gave him pause. "How certain are you, Miguel?" the bishop asked. "Your Excellency," Father Miguel replied, "I have been a priest for 56 years. I have seen false apparitions. I have seen religious fraud. I have seen desperate people who want so badly to see heaven that they imagine it where it isn't. This is not that. Something is happening in Fresno, something real, and we must pay attention." On the 8th day after Daniel's encounter in the playground, a photographer from the Fresno Bee named James Sullivan went to St. Anthony's Chapel to document the religious fervor for a feature story. He was an agnostic who approached religion with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal customs. He took pictures of the crowds, the candles, the flowers people had started leaving by the playground fence. He interviewed Father Miguel and several witnesses, nodding politely while thinking about how he'd frame the story. Probably something about how communities create shared mythologies to cope with poverty and powerlessness. As the sun set, James stood alone in the abandoned playground, taking shots of the rusted swings in the golden light. He was framing a shot when he saw her in his viewfinder. A woman in blue, standing near the old slide, looking directly at the camera. He lowered the camera, his heart suddenly pounding. The playground was empty. He raised the camera again. She was there, visible only through the lens, smiling at him with such warmth that he felt tears spring to his eyes. He pressed the shutter. The flash fired, and when his vision cleared, the playground was empty once more. His hands shaking, James checked the camera's display screen, expecting nothing. A trick of light, a lens flare, something explainable. The photograph showed the woman clearly. She stood in perfect detail, her blue dress vivid against the faded playground equipment. Her face turned toward the camera with an expression of infinite love. The image was sharp, well exposed, impossible to dismiss as a blur or a trick, but it was her eyes that made James's knees weaken. Even in the digital photograph, they held a depth he'd never captured in any human portrait, as if they saw through the camera, through the lens, directly into his soul. James Sullivan, who had not prayed since his mother's funeral 15 years ago, fell to his knees in that abandoned playground and wept. He clutched his camera like a lifeline, staring at the impossible photograph on his screen, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his skepticism crumble into dust. The Virgin Mary was in Fresno. She was real. She was here. And she had allowed herself to be photographed. When the photograph ran on the front page of the Fresno Bee 3 days later, it would ignite a firestorm that would reach far beyond California, bringing pilgrims and skeptics, believers and investigators, all seeking to understand what was happening in this forgotten corner of the Central Valley. But that night, James simply knelt in the playground where a lonely boy had met the Mother of God and whispered the only prayer he could remember. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Above him the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the gathering night a woman in blue smiled. The photograph changed everything. When the Fresno Bee published James Sullivan's image on their front page under the headline, "Mystery Woman Appears in Photo at Site of Reported Visions," the reaction was immediate and polarizing. Within hours, the photograph had been shared tens of thousands of times across social media. Some called it proof of the divine. Others called it fraud, Photoshop, a desperate grab for attention by a dying newspaper. But James Sullivan didn't care what they called it. He had been there. He had seen her through his lens. He had felt her presence like a physical force, and no amount of skepticism from armchair critics could erase the moment his entire understanding of reality had shattered in an abandoned playground. The photograph itself was remarkable for its clarity. Forensic analysts hired by both the newspaper and several skeptical organizations examined it exhaustively. They found no evidence of digital manipulation, no signs of double exposure or lens trickery. The metadata was intact and showed the image had been captured exactly when and where James claimed. The woman's appearance defied simple explanation. Her clothing showed details that shouldn't have been visible in the fading light. Her face possessed a luminosity that couldn't be attributed to the camera's flash. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a professor of digital imaging at Stanford who examined the photograph, gave a statement that went viral. "I cannot explain this image through any photographic techniques I'm familiar with. That doesn't mean it's supernatural. Only that if it's a hoax, it's the most sophisticated one I've ever encountered. And if it's real, then we're looking at something that challenges our understanding of what's possible." Within 72 hours of the photograph's publication, Fresno became a pilgrimage site. Thousands descended on St. Anthony's Chapel and the playground behind it. Sick people came seeking healing. Lost people came seeking direction. Faithful people came seeking confirmation. Skeptics came to debunk. Media crews from across the country set up cameras to document what some were calling the Fresno Miracle, and others, mass religious hysteria. The city struggled to manage the crowds. Police had to close streets around the chapel. Vendors appeared selling rosaries, candles, and bottled water. Hotels filled beyond capacity. The playground that had once been an abandoned eyesore became sacred ground, with people kneeling in prayer on the cracked asphalt, weeping, singing hymns in a dozen languages. Daniel Reyes became an unwilling celebrity. Reporters camped outside his apartment building, trying to interview the boy who had first encountered the woman in blue. Rosa and Javier, terrified by the attention, kept Daniel home from school and refused all interview requests. They installed cheap curtains to block cameras and unplugged their phone after the 100th call from journalists. "We just want our son to be safe," Rosa pleaded with Father Miguel, who had become the family's protector and intermediary. "This is too much, he's just a little boy." Father Miguel understood. He had seen religious fervor turn destructive before, had watched how holy things could be corrupted by human hunger for spectacle. He stationed volunteers from the parish outside the Reyes apartment to turn away reporters and gawkers. He personally escorted the family to and from the chapel when they came to pray, shielding them from the crowds that wanted to touch Daniel, to ask him questions, to somehow absorb his blessing by proximity. But while the media circus swirled and commentators debated, something else was happening, something the cameras couldn't capture and the skeptics couldn't explain. People were being healed. Not everyone, not even most. But enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or placebo effect. A woman named Elena Flores arrived in Fresno with stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized to her bones. She had weeks to live, maybe less. Her daughter had driven her from Los Angeles after seeing the photograph, a desperate final hope. Elena was so weak she had to be pushed in a wheelchair to the playground. She knelt there for 3 hours, praying the rosary until her voice gave out, weeping until she had no tears left. That night, the pain that had been her constant companion for months vanished. The next morning, confused and frightened, she went to St. Agnes Hospital and demanded a scan. The oncologist who reviewed her results called in 2 colleagues because he didn't believe what he was seeing. The tumors were gone, not shrinking, not in remission, simply gone, as if they had never existed. The scarring in her bones remained, evidence that the cancer had been there but the disease itself had disappeared. "I don't believe in miracles," the oncologist told Elena, his hands shaking as he held her scans. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years and I don't believe in miracles. But I have no medical explanation for this. None." Elena returned to the playground every day for a week, not seeking anything more but simply offering gratitude. On the 7th day, she saw the woman in blue standing near the fence, watching the crowds with an expression of joy and sorrow mingled together. Their eyes met, and the woman nodded once before disappearing. Elena would spend the rest of her life, another 43 years, telling her story to anyone who would listen. Others were healed of depression that had plagued them for decades, addictions they'd battled their entire adult lives, marriages that had been dead for years. A homeless veteran named Marcus Webb, who had lost his legs in Afghanistan and his faith in everything afterward, received a vision of the woman while sleeping rough under a bridge near the chapel. She told him his suffering had purpose, that he was loved beyond measure, that his life was not over, but beginning. Marcus woke weeping and wheeled himself to the VA hospital, where he enrolled in PTSD treatment he'd refused for 8 years. 6 months later, he would be working as a peer counselor, helping other veterans find hope in their darkness. But the healings brought their own problems. The crowds grew larger, more desperate. Fights broke out over space near the playground. Scam artists appeared, selling blessed water from the Virgin Spring and rosaries she personally touched. The city threatened to shut down the area entirely if the chaos continued. And then, on the 14th day after Daniel's first encounter, something happened that no one could ignore. It was a Wednesday evening, and Father Miguel was leading a prayer service in the packed chapel when a commotion erupted outside. Screams, not of pain but of shock, wonder, terror. The priest rushed outside along with hundreds of others. Above the playground, clearly visible in the darkening sky, a light had appeared. Not a searchlight or a drone or any explainable phenomenon, but a pure white luminescence that hung in the air like a second sun. It didn't hurt to look at, didn't cast shadows the way normal light does. Instead, it seemed to radiate peace, to fill the air with a presence that made people fall to their knees instinctively. And in that light, for approximately 90 seconds witnessed by more than 3,000 people and captured on hundreds of cell phone cameras, the silhouette of a woman appeared. She didn't speak. No voice came from the light. But everyone present later reported feeling a message in their hearts, wordless but undeniable. "I am here. I see your suffering. I have come to bring hope to the hopeless, dignity to the forgotten, love to the unloved. Do not be afraid." When the light faded and the figure vanished, the crowd stood in absolute silence. Then someone began singing Ave Maria, and thousands of voices joined in, the hymn rising into the night sky where the light had been. Mrs. Catherine Mitchell, who had been present, found herself weeping and singing words to a Latin prayer she'd never learned, had never heard but somehow knew. Her 17-year exile from God ended in that moment. Every argument she'd ever made against faith dissolving in the face of what she'd witnessed. She would later say it was like being born again, but that phrase seemed too small for what had happened. It was more like being born for the first time, like she'd been sleepwalking through a gray world and suddenly woke to find it blazing with color. James Sullivan captured the event on video. The footage would be analyzed by experts around the world. Meteorologists confirmed no atmospheric conditions that could explain the light. Aviation authorities confirmed no aircraft in the area. Special effects artists studied the video frame by frame and found no evidence of CGI or manipulation. Whatever had appeared over Fresno that evening defied conventional explanation. The Catholic Church could no longer ignore what was happening. The bishop dispatched a formal investigation team led by Father Anthony Castellano, a Jesuit priest known for his skepticism and rigorous approach to claims of miracles. Father Castellano had investigated 17 reported Marian apparitions over his career and had debunked 16 of them. He arrived in Fresno expecting to find the 17th. But when he interviewed Daniel Reyes, something in the child's simple, unembellished testimony gave him pause. When he examined the rosary that had allegedly appeared from a sealed grave, his certainty wavered. When he spoke with Elena Flores and reviewed her medical records, his skepticism began to crack. And when he visited the playground at dusk and felt a presence there he couldn't name but couldn't deny, Father Castellano found himself confronting the possibility he'd spent his career avoiding, that sometimes, rarely, the barrier between heaven and earth becomes thin and grace breaks through. "This requires more investigation," he told the bishop. "But Your Excellency, I believe something genuine is occurring here. I don't make this statement lightly. I've spent 20 years being the Church's professional skeptic, but I've never encountered anything like this. The investigation would take months, would involve medical experts and theologians, psychologists and physicists, but the conclusion would eventually come. The Church could find no natural explanation for the events in Fresno, and substantial evidence suggested supernatural intervention consistent with Marian apparition. But on that 14th night, as the light faded from the sky and the crowd slowly dispersed, Daniel Reyes stood with his parents in the playground where he'd first met the woman in blue. The crowds had been cleared from this inner area by police, giving the family a moment of privacy. "Mama," Daniel said quietly, "she's going to come back. One more time. For me, she told me." Rosa knelt beside her son. "When, mijo? How do you know?" "I just know," Daniel said, touching his heart. "Soon. And when she comes, she's going to tell me something important. Something everyone needs to hear." The final apparition would come 3 days later, and it would not be public. It would be witnessed only by Daniel and his family, by Father Miguel, and by Mrs. Catherine Mitchell, the skeptic who had become a believer. And the message the Virgin would deliver to Daniel Reyes, the lonely boy whom the world had overlooked until heaven itself noticed his tears, would be simple but profound. But that's not what would test their faith most severely. What would test them, what would push every witness to the edge of doubt, was what happened next, in the hours just before that final apparition, something that would make them question whether any of it had been real at all. The crisis came without warning, as crises often do. On the morning of the 17th day after Daniel's first encounter, Rosa Reyes woke to find her son burning with fever. His temperature was 104 degrees. His skin was pale and clammy. He couldn't keep down water. When she tried to wake him fully, his eyes rolled back and he began convulsing. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours to Rosa, who held her unconscious son and prayed with a desperation that felt like her chest was being torn open. Javier met them at St. Agnes Hospital, running from the parking lot, still wearing his work clothes covered in field dust, his face twisted with terror. The doctors worked quickly. CT scans, blood work, spinal tap to rule out meningitis. Daniel lay small and fragile in the pediatric ICU, hooked to machines that beeped and whirred, IV lines running into his thin arms. The preliminary diagnosis was viral encephalitis, inflammation of the brain that could cause permanent damage or death. "We're doing everything we can, Doctor," Sarah Chen told the parents, her face grave. "The next 48 hours are critical. You should prepare yourselves for any outcome." The news spread through Fresno like wildfire. The boy who had met the Virgin Mary was dying. The child who had sparked a spiritual awakening was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Social media exploded with speculation, prayers, and, most painfully for those who believed, mockery. "Where's your miracle now?" skeptics posted. "If the Virgin Mary really appeared to this kid, why is she letting him die?" "This proves it was all mass hysteria," wrote a prominent atheist blogger. "The psychological stress of being thrust into the spotlight broke this poor child's brain. This is what happens when religious delusion replaces medical science." Television commentators debated whether the apparitions had been a folie à plusieurs, a shared psychotic disorder, and whether Daniel's illness was psychosomatic, a breakdown under the pressure of attention and expectation. Even some believers wavered. Father Miguel received anguished calls from parishioners. Why would God let this happen? If she really came to Daniel, why isn't she protecting him now? Mrs. Catherine Mitchell sat in the hospital waiting room, her newly rekindled faith being tested by fire. She had seen the woman at the window. She had witnessed the light in the sky. She had felt the presence that had transformed her life. But now, doubt crept in like poison. Had it all been delusion? Had she seen what she wanted to see? Was Daniel dying because God was absent, or because God had never been there at all? "I don't understand," she whispered to Father Miguel, who sat beside her, his weathered hands clutching his own rosary. Why would she appear to him only to let him die? The old priest's face was haggard. He had been awake for 36 hours, praying in the chapel, anointing Daniel with the sacrament of the sick, comforting Rosa and Javier as they kept vigil by their son's bedside. But his eyes, though exhausted, held something unshaken. "I have been a priest for 56 years, he said quietly, "and I have learned that faith is not the absence of suffering. It is trust in the presence of suffering." The Virgin Mary did not appear to Daniel to make his life easy. She appeared because his suffering mattered, because he mattered. And that doesn't change, even if... His voice caught. Even if we lose him. On the second night of Daniel's hospitalization, as his condition worsened and the doctors began preparing his parents for the worst, Rosa sat alone in the hospital chapel. It was 3 a.m. She had sent Javier home to sleep. Someone needed to be rested enough to make decisions if the end came quickly. Rosa knelt before a small statue of Mary, her face wet with tears that wouldn't stop coming. She had been praying the rosary for hours, but now the words felt empty, mechanical. Her faith, which had been strengthened so miraculously by the appearance of the rosary from her mother's grave, now felt like a cruel joke. "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why did you come to him? Why did you give us hope? Why did you show us you were real only to take him away? What was the point? What was any of it for?" She wept bitterly, her body shaking. "If you're going to take him, then take me instead, please. He's just a baby. He's innocent. He's suffered enough. Haven't we all suffered enough?" The chapel was silent except for Rosa's sobs. No voice answered, no presence manifested, no comfort came. And in that moment of absolute darkness, Rosa felt her faith die. She stood, threw the rosary, the impossible rosary that had started everything, onto the floor and walked out. She returned to Daniel's room, where machines measured his failing life in numbers that kept dropping. She climbed into the narrow hospital bed beside her son, careful of the tubes and wires, and held him as she had when he was an infant. She sang him a lullaby in Spanish, her voice breaking on every note. "Duerme, duerme, negrito, que tu mama está en el campo, negrito." As dawn approached and Daniel's breathing became more labored, Dr. Chen entered quietly. Her face said everything. "Mrs. Reyes, his brain swelling is increasing. We've done everything medically possible. I think you should call your husband, and anyone else you want present. I'm so sorry." Rosa nodded numbly. She made the calls. Father Miguel, Javier, Mrs. Mitchell, who had been sleeping in the waiting room. They gathered in Daniel's room as the sun rose over Fresno, bathing the city in golden light that felt obscene in its beauty. How dare the world be beautiful when Daniel was dying? Javier held his wife, both of them holding their son. Father Miguel prayed quietly. Mrs. Mitchell stood in the corner weeping silently, her rekindled faith dying with this child. And then, at 6:47 a.m., the machines began to alarm. Daniel's heart rate was dropping. His breathing was irregular. This was the end. But instead of panic, instead of nurses rushing in, something else happened. The room filled with the scent of roses, not the artificial smell of air freshener or perfume, but the deep, sweet fragrance of real roses in full bloom, so powerful it was almost overwhelming. Every person in the room smelled it simultaneously. Father Miguel's head snapped up. Mrs. Mitchell stopped crying mid-sob. Rosa and Javier looked at each other, then around the room, searching for the source. The temperature changed. The hospital room had been cold with air conditioning, but now warmth filled the space. Not oppressive heat, but the gentle warmth of being embraced. And Daniel's eyes opened. Not the clouded, unseeing eyes of a child slipping into death, but clear, bright, focused eyes. He looked directly at a point in the room where nothing visible stood, and he smiled, a smile of pure joy. "You came," he whispered. "You came back." "Daniel." Rosa grabbed his face. "Mijo, can you hear me?" But Daniel wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at something, someone that only he could see. "I see her," he said, his voice stronger. "She's here. She's so beautiful. She's smiling." Tears ran down his cheeks. She says she never left. She was here the whole time. We just couldn't see her." The machines showed Daniel's vital signs stabilizing. His heart rate steadied, his breathing regulated. Dr. Chen, who had entered the room expecting to pronounce time of death, stood frozen, staring at the monitors in disbelief. Daniel continued speaking, though his eyes never left the invisible presence. "She says she didn't come to take away suffering. She came to be present in suffering. She says, that's what love does. Love doesn't make pain disappear. Love enters the pain with us so we don't have to face it alone." Rosa was sobbing now, but these were different tears. "Daniel, what else is she saying?" "She's saying she wants everyone to know that every lonely child matters. Every person who feels invisible matters. Every tear that falls in the dark is seen. Every prayer that feels unanswered is heard. She says heaven is not far away. It's close. So close. Right here, even when we can't feel it." Daniel reached out his hand as if someone were taking it. "She says she has to go now, but she'll never really leave. She says to tell everyone, when you feel most alone, that's when you're most loved. When you feel most abandoned, that's when heaven is closest, because that's when God understands you best." His hand dropped back to the bed. The scent of roses began to fade, the warmth dissipated, and Daniel looked at his mother for the first time, fully present, fully himself. "I'm not going to die, Mama," he said simply. "She healed me. But that's not the miracle. The miracle is that she was here all along, even when we thought she'd left. Even when you threw away the rosary. She was here." Within 3 hours, Daniel's fever had broken completely. Within 6 hours, his brain scans showed the inflammation had vanished. Within 12 hours, every test Dr. Chen ran came back normal. Not improving, not healing, but normal, as if the encephalitis had never existed. "I have no medical explanations, Doctor," Chen told the assembled witnesses, her voice shaking. "According to everything I know about medicine, this child should be dead or severely brain damaged. Instead, he's completely healthy. I don't know what this is." Mrs. Catherine Mitchell, who had felt her faith dying just hours before, fell to her knees in the hospital room and wept. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of understanding. She had thought faith meant the absence of darkness. She had thought miracles meant protection from pain. But now she understood. Faith meant trusting that even in the darkest darkness, love was present. Miracles weren't always about avoiding death. Sometimes they were about finding meaning in the midst of it, or being carried through it, or discovering that death itself wasn't the end of love. The story of Daniel's healing spread as quickly as the story of his illness. The skeptics had no response. The medical records were public. The doctor's testimony was clear. The child had been dying, and then he wasn't. And the only explanation was one that science couldn't provide. But for those who had been in that room, who had smelled the roses and felt the warmth and watched a dying child return to life, the healing itself wasn't the most important thing that happened that morning. It was the message. The message that the Virgin had come not to eliminate suffering, but to sanctify it. That she hadn't appeared to Daniel to make him special, but to show that every overlooked child was special. That miracles weren't about cosmic intervention changing the rules, but about grace revealing what had been true all along. That love was present, always present, even when, especially when, it was invisible. Daniel recovered completely. He returned to school 2 weeks later, not as a celebrity, but as an ordinary second grader who still struggled with reading and still ate burritos for lunch. The crowds around St. Anthony's gradually dispersed. The media found other stories. Life in Fresno returned to something approaching normal, but everything had changed. Tyler Brennan, the boy who had tormented Daniel, became a youth minister 30 years later and would spend his life teaching teenagers about redemption and second chances. Mrs. Catherine Mitchell returned to teaching but started a program for bullied and isolated children, creating safe spaces where lonely kids could find friendship and support. James Sullivan's photograph hung in churches around the world, and he devoted the rest of his career to documenting stories of faith and hope. Rosa Reyes returned to the hospital chapel 1 week after Daniel came home. She found the rosary where she had thrown it, still lying on the floor where no one had moved it. She picked it up, held it to her chest, and wept, not because she had doubted, but because she had learned that doubt itself was part of faith, that questioning was not the opposite of belief but the deepest form of it. Father Miguel lived to be 91, and every day until his death he celebrated Mass in St. Anthony's Chapel, which never closed and never stopped being full. The playground was eventually renovated and turned into a beautiful prayer garden, maintained by volunteers who considered it holy ground. And Daniel? Daniel grew up to become a counselor who worked with traumatized children. He never spoke publicly about what happened to him except to say, when asked, "I learned that being seen by heaven matters more than being seen by the world, and I learned that the Virgin Mary doesn't appear to make our lives easier. She appears to make our suffering meaningful, to show us we're never alone even when we feel most invisible." The church officially recognized the Fresno apparitions as worthy of belief in 2032, after years of investigation. But for those who had witnessed what happened in that forgotten playground, in that hospital room, in that moment when heaven broke through into a broken world, no official recognition was needed. They knew what they had seen. They knew what they had felt. They knew that for 17 days in Fresno, California, the Mother of God had walked among the poor and the forgotten and the suffering, and she had delivered a message the world desperately needed to hear. You are seen. You are loved. You are never, ever alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Subscribe to receive daily miracles and messages of hope, because in a world that often feels dark, we all need reminders that heaven is closer than we think, that grace breaks through in the places we least expect, for the people the world overlooks. The blessing in Fresno wasn't just for Daniel Reyes. It was for every lonely child, every suffering soul, every person who has ever cried in the dark and wondered if anyone was listening. The answer is always yes. Someone is always listening, and her love never fails.